Welcome to everybody that's joining our session about women in leadership. We're very excited to present this session today with a special presenter. And I do want to just go over a couple of technical logistics for this session. You'll notice that your microphones are muted and the video is off, and that is intentional to avoid disruption in the presentation. But I do want to point out at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. That's where we encourage you to submit your questions for our guest presenter. And what will happen is at the end of the session, after she's finished presenting, I'll moderate and read the questions on a first come basis. So please engage, put your questions in the chat at the in the Q&A at the bottom, and we will get to them. And also one final thing I do want to point out is this session is being recorded so that we can share it to the broader community, and we're so thankful for that. So I'd now like to pass this over to Dr. Claire Kelly, Assistant Head of Student Life, to introduce today's special presenter. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much, Ms. Snyder. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I've had the wonderful pleasure of knowing Chinny since I was in boarding life and at the school since 2002. I'd like to introduce Chinny with a few words about her background. So Chinny Mamegwa, class of 07, is co-head of sports investment banking and a senior vice president on the internet banking coverage team at Goldman Sachs. In her role, Chinny is responsible for day-to-day coverage and execution across a broad range of technology and media clients, having advised on 100 billion in M&A and financing transactions for consumer internet, sports, and digital media clients. Chinny joined Goldman Sachs in 2011 as an analyst and earned a BSc in economics and finance with honors from New York University's Stern School of Business. While at Appleby, Chinny earned bronze, silver, and gold optimates and served as the Bailey House prefect. It is my delight to pass this over to Chinny this morning to talk about women in leadership.
Great, thank you, Dr. Kelly, and thank you for the introduction. So thank you everyone for joining this morning, and I appreciate you spending time with us here at 9 o'clock in the morning. As someone who is a morning person, I appreciate that sometimes others aren't, so it's great to have the whole group. I want to make this session hopefully helpful to you as you think about both yourself as a woman in leadership, and then more importantly, everybody who will interact with women who are leaders. I think it's really important as we take a step back to understand some of the key things that we'll talk about as part of this, which is, the misconceptions of women in leadership. What challenges do they face? How do you manage both your career as a woman, and then I think more importantly, seeing the bias of it to reporting as a woman. I'm looking forward to the session, and I'm hopeful that it can drive some discussion. And so feel free to Melanie's point to put questions in the chat, and we're going to have a bunch of time for Q&A at the end. As Dr. Kelly mentioned, I've been at Goldman my entire career, and I was the class of 2007 at Appleby, which doesn't feel that long ago, but somehow is almost 15 years ago. So that's a thing for me to deal with later. After Appleby, I went to NYU, where I studied economics, finance, and public policy. And I've been fortunate enough in my career to have worked in everything from education to politics, and now having spent the last decade in finance. And so I spent 8 months as an intern for former President Clinton in communications. I joined Goldman Sachs, and I've worked largely in male-dominated industries. And so it's meant that for most of my career, my bosses have been men. Today, in the seat that I sit in, covering internet companies and sports clients, it means I help take companies that are particularly on the consumer side public, but it means I've largely worked for women. It's sort of been an interesting twist over the last 5 years of my career has now been led by and guided by female leaders. And it wasn't purposeful, it sort of has happened accidentally, but it's given me a chance to understand the breadth of leadership that comes across from being a man and a woman, and an understanding working for both. And then one of the threads that has tied that career together is the women who have been critical voices in shaping my leadership, and I think it's really important, have been very different leaders. I think one of the misconceptions we'll talk about is there's a misconception that women have to lead in a certain way, and I have been fortunate enough to I work for women who lead very differently than that misconception, and it has forced me to have to develop a style that looks a little bit different. And so I think it's really important to understand that your leadership as a woman can look differently, and it's okay to have it be in shades of your personality. And so look, over the, one of the things that will also guide this conversation is I've had the chance to manage teams from 2 to 5. I spent a year managing 90 junior people, which will teach you a lot because you start to see the gender differences. And so the goal for this, and I really want to make this sort of 3 things that I hope people get out of this. 1, help break down misconceptions and some of the challenges that women still face as leaders. 2, share the feedback I've heard over my career that's shaped how I've built my leadership style, particularly on how to advocate for yourself as a woman and improve your leadership skills. And then 3, I want to leave with some concrete advice on how do you also manage female leaders? Because I think one of the biggest things we have to do, and I'm a big believer, that half the battle of getting more women in leadership is that today's leaders need to recognize bias in how we evaluate this quote unquote leadership skill, particularly across genders, and then proactively bend that bias curve. And so I think it's incredibly important in the smallest of ways, biggest of ways, if you interact with female leaders, that you are a critical voice in shaping that direction. And so those are sort of the goals for the session. And so why don't we start on topic number 1 on sort of misconceptions in leadership. One of the things I always hear from people, and maybe we get it from all the content we end up consuming, is this idea that women are more emotional leaders. They lead from the heart, they lead from consensus, they lead from agreement. And it's one of those misconceptions that ends up characterizing and coloring how we think about leadership as a skill set. Because leadership as a skill set, and I used to always have, even from high school, you start to see people develop leadership as a skill set in this male described way. We attribute gender characteristics to it that look very much like how we describe men. And so when you then start from the bias that women are more emotional leaders, we make this disconnect that women are not as good leaders. And it's sort of interesting. I think one of the, there's a survey that HBS did many years ago that said, well, it asked a group of 100 people, do you agree that women are every bit as capable as men as being leaders? Everybody said, yes, I agree, strongly agree. This is very true. It gave skill sets of leaders. Do you agree that women are as innovative, are as communicative? Everybody said, yes, totally agree. There's no disconnect. And most of the survey participants actually ranked men and women the same. But when guided down questions that were a little bit vague, most of those survey participants ended up diverting into preferring working for men. And it's sort of interesting to me that unbeknownst to them, the skill sets and the way, and I'll talk through an example of it because I lived through this with one of my brothers. The way we think about the conversations we have with women when they lead us, let us take things differently and then adjust ourselves differently. And so it's to me a fascinating human behavior pattern. And I think that misconceptions is a huge part, is a huge thing for us to think about. When we think about the skill sets of leadership as actually indistinguishable, the most important thing we then have to do is recognize that bias and then manage and shape our decision points. And so one of my brothers is a good example of this. He's worked his entire career like me in largely male-dominated industries, and that typically means most of his bosses have been men. And a few years ago, him and I were having a conversation because for the first time he had a female boss and she gave him feedback. And he is not someone who doesn't, he does most things very well, and so he takes feedback very personally. I sort of stepped back to him and I said, is the way you're perceiving this different because it came from her and not your last boss who was a guy? And he looked at me and he said, no, absolutely not. It's the same. Like, it's just, I don't think this is right. I said, take a step back, think about it. What is making this small of differences in your perception of the message? So I don't know that you're telling me you disagree with the message. I think you're saying the message was harsher than it should have been. But I want you to push on that. And I remember it took a week, he stepped back, and then I got a call and he said, yeah, I think you're maybe right, but only maybe. And I said, okay, let's push on the maybe. and we had a very long conversation about it. And I think that is the important thing, is that your perception of women in leadership ends up shaping some of that message. And, I think that is it is such an important thing. And I hope more people do it, particularly, by the way, do it in big ways and small ways. Do it in your classroom with male teachers and female teachers, because I'd see it all the time on campus in college and in high school, of people perceive it differently. And so the first thing I want to force us to do is take a step back and really focus on on how we take in messages, particularly with that gender lens. And I hope more people start to challenge themselves on that. And then I think moving to the point of, okay, now we've talked about that misconception. You are the woman in leadership. How do we take that next step forward? Most women in leadership roles, and whenever I have mentees, I'm very honest with them about this, is you will face a common dilemma. If you are strong and assertive as a voice, you will sometimes be stereotyped as a little bit on the abrasive side. If you aren't assertive enough, you'll be stereotyped as weak. But there's a natural instinct to try and overcorrect that, and it's one I've gotten my entire career of. You have to find that balance. And so I always tell, particularly mentees of mine, is take the misconceptions, know that they exist, but don't make your reaction to them how you build your leadership skill set. And I particularly for young women who are just starting their career, that to me is the most important thing you can do, is to not overreact your style and the style you build to the misconceptions that we just spent the last 5 minutes talking about. Because what it ends up doing is you create an unnatural style that is actually not how you lead. And I think the most important thing you can do as a leader is find your approach to it. And I take that very seriously. Of everybody is different, everybody leads differently, everybody thinks differently. And the last 10 years of my life have been finding ways to figure out my style. And all of those things, whether good or bad, are going to be different by person. And the mistake I see a lot of, particularly young women coming up in their career, is try to force to either lead like they think a man should, overcorrect of what they think a woman should. It just build your style. And I am hopeful that the world will understand and eventually shape to the right direction of understanding your style. And I think you have to understand that all leaders, regardless of gender, will face conflict, and they'll face resistance, and you'll face people who think differently, act differently, communicate differently. And so really the key is, in the face of that conflict, what's your reaction to it? And what's your ability to step into the role of, I believe X, I hold firm on that, and my leadership style comes out of it. And so a good example, I am someone who I lead from a place of preparation. For me, leadership comes down to, I don't like to be in a room and not be the most prepared person. And it gives me comfort as a leader that teams can come to me, and I know I can give myself the ability to think and plan 10 steps ahead, because I know and trust that I'm on the more prepared side in the room. I lead from a place of, my communication style tends to be direct, but my communication style is also it comes from, it's, as my friends would describe it, it comes from a mother bear aspect. So I am direct with you, but anybody who works for me will always sort of jokes of, I will be the first person that protects and cares about someone's career. And so I think finding the words for that, because it means that directness sometimes will overcorrect, right? It's the same thing. I always joke with my mom of, directness will sometimes then mean you are very direct with someone. And so you have to find the good and bad of your leadership style, understand the good and bad of your leadership style, and then make sure you're actually appreciating the good and bad of it. And so it takes many years to develop, and I'm hopeful that the mistakes you make along the way, and the mistakes I've made along the way, have been critical in developing that. And so that's the misconception side of it and the challenges. Look, I think ultimately as a leader, and particularly as a woman who's leading, I always come back to you have the good fortune, particularly and I really believe it for our generation, of there's a lot of great women that have come up, regardless of what you decide to do in your life, your career. There's a lot of great women who have done a lot of the hard work of breaking the first glass ceiling. Like, I really believe that. And I think we have the good fortune of stepping into that next rung, and we won't be the parity. I am optimistic, but guarded on the fact that we will not be the generation where, we are 50% of political leadership roles and 50% of corporate leadership roles. I think that is probably the generation after us. But what it means is we're the first generation that's going to, if you look around the world today, 20 countries are led by women. Like, that's an incredible thing. And some of the most impactful countries have been led by women. Like, we're the first generation that gets to say that. And that's an incredible thing. And so I think as a steward of that, I always think about it as, are you making it easier for the next woman who takes your leadership role to be a leader in her style? And so are you letting yourself make good and bad decisions and be okay with that and step into that? Because that's ultimately leadership. And so I always come back to that is the goal. That is, make it easier for the next woman who takes this position to get to lead the way they want to lead. And particularly when you work with mostly men, it's sort of the framework to how I come to this question all the time. So that's question number one. Question number two. So you're a leader. How do you advocate for yourself? How do you make sure that what are the tips to your leadership skills? How do you think about the next generation and managing that? I always say, and I'm going to do 5 things. Number one, I think negotiation is really important. Many women, and this is a natural thing, and it's been the hardest thing for my career. Many women would rather go to a dentist than negotiate for themselves. And this was a Pew survey, and I just thought it was funny because I both hate the dentist and negotiating. But we're taught early that there's a need to find equity in relationships. And one of the things you learn very quickly as a leader, particularly when you negotiate with someone, is that it never quite feels equal. And you have to be okay in that discomfort. And so forcing yourself to be okay in that discomfort. And you're going to have to feel like you are taking something away from someone or asking someone to do something that is unnatural. It feels like the opposite of everything that you've been taught. But it's really, really important that as a woman, you learn how to negotiate and you learn what your skill set is in negotiation. And it's everything from, the example I always sometimes think about is, I manage a team of 5 people. And it means those 5 people have books of business that are important. And we have to have conversations about, how do you think about where you're spending your time? Is that the right place for you to spend your time? I think you should be doing X. And for me, it always felt unnatural to have those conversations with people without understanding their goals. And so for me, my negotiation strength and my ability to have those conversations comes from, I want to really understand your viewpoint on this issue. And I spend a lot of time before I get into conversations with people trying to put myself in their shoes. And so I think find your avenue for negotiation. Are you the vocal negotiator? Are you the quiet negotiator? But I think really spending time in that discomfort of, I have to ask someone to do something, is a really critical skill set for a leader. And it's one that I find a lot of my mentees who are women who are coming after me in my career, it's one I find that we struggle with the most. And so I always come back to sit in the discomfort of asking for something. And by the way, it starts before you're a leader, right? It starts in the first time you get a job and you think you deserve a promotion and you have to advocate for yourself. That's a way to test that leadership skill. It starts in the first time you have to, get feedback from a boss that you disagree with. That's a way to negotiate that leadership skill. And so I think really spending your time developing that muscle is important. The second one, and it's one that I feel strongly about as for all leaders, and I think men, women, emotional intelligence. Like, I actually think emotional intelligence as a leader ends up being the most critical skill set in my toolkit. It's how I think about, if I walk into a room, how do I read that room quickly? How do I understand the people in it, understand their goals, clue into the issues? And it then drives my respect and my empathy. And so I always go back to, a leader has to really be emotionally intelligent. And it doesn't mean you have to be the most vocal. And I think we always perceive that emotional intelligence skill as vocal. And I want us to disconnect that, because it's not the person that talks the most or, helps to drive the conversation. It's really the who understands all of the people I'm leading, this room that I am in, what is our goal here, and who's able to drive that consensus. And so, it doesn't sound like an impressive skill, and it's sort of funny. It's one of those soft skills that we sometimes don't give enough credit. But I think it's one of the most important things you can build for yourself, is really trying to find a way to find empathy, find respect, find understanding in people. I always say, look, you can be like the best of performers without being emotionally intelligent, but I think it's really, really hard. And I think it stacks the decks against you pretty big. And so, really spend time developing that emotional intelligence. And so negotiation, emotional intelligence, and then feedback. I think feedback and being able to receive feedback, give feedback is incredibly important, and creating that culture for your teams to feel comfortable and for you to feel comfortable giving and receiving feedback, I think is really it's really key to being a great leader. I always come back to, as the leader of a team, regardless of what that leadership role looks like, one of the best things that you can do for the people you manage is make them comfortable that they can tell you when you aren't doing well, so that you can get better and they can get better. And I think creating that feedback loop is such an important thing, and drives morale. It makes the team better. It drives positivity. And by the way, there's a gender dimension to this, right? Because we talked about the misconception of how we perceive feedback across genders. And so what you have to really think about as a woman is making sure that you don't overcorrect how you deliver. It was one of the feedback I used to get early in my career when I first started getting leadership roles, was people don't feel like you're communicating to them when they do something wrong. And I took a step back and I sort of said, okay, I wonder why that is. And I realized it was a overcorrection to not wanting to be perceived as, emotional, and so I had overcorrected to actually just not being a good leader. And so I think it's really, really important. And this is one where we sometimes overcorrect as women. Be firm in building a feedback culture and understanding that it may create initial bumps, but in the long term is the right way to think about your leadership skill set. And then I think, look, if you're a woman, the fourth one is seek out opportunities to actually take on leadership roles. It's a good thing, whether big or small. Actively ask for those roles. I said I took a year and I managed our junior banker population. And one of the things I learned from managing 90 people who were sort of in between years 1 and 5 of their career is the men were in my office asking for more consistently. And it was sort of a fascinating realization of sometimes people get more because they're the ones asking. And I want us to push ourselves to ask. And by the way, and it'll come back to the fifth one that I will come back to as a leader, how you level that playing field. But as a woman, step out of your comfort zone and ask for those opportunities. Ask for the at-bats. They won't all go well, but you can't get what you don't ask for. And so I feel very strongly about, you got to force yourself to take those skill sets, and you got to force yourself to step into that. And so negotiation, emotional intelligence, creating a feedback culture, seek out opportunities. And then I think the last one is, if you're a leader, examine your own biases, like actually understand your biases on gender, your biases on race, like examine those biases and try and level the playing field. And so I talked about, I would find that my male colleagues were stepping into the room to ask for more opportunities. And so I had to force myself. And I think my first month in that role, I was finding, why does it feels like I'm giving more opportunities to the men? And I sort of said, oh, it's because they're the ones in your office asking every day. And so I had to force myself to say, it's not just who asks, but I think you are ready for this. And so you didn't ask me, but I'm going to give you that role. And so step into that as a leader of, it's your team, it's your opportunity. And so you have to force yourself to level the playing field. It is imperative that you are the force function on leveling the playing field. And so it takes work, it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes actively, by the way, leaning on all of the other skill sets we talked about. But it is one of the things I think we have to step into as leaders, is you have to be an ally, a mentor, and a sponsor for women. And that means you have to understand some of the guardrails that come in that are just societal, and you have to be okay with saying these are things that exist, and step into that and force function the playing field. And so I think for me, it comes back to that. If someone said, what are the tips you have for, I think the question was, what are the tips you have for the next generation of female leaders? I think you have to prepare yourself and understand your negotiating style, really understand your approach to emotional intelligence, and work on building that skill set, because it's not a soft skill throwaway. Create a feedback culture on teams that you work with and leaders that you work for. Step into the opportunities and ask for those opportunities. And then once you're the leader, examine your biases and level the playing field. I think those are ultimately how we get to more women in leadership, more women who look differently in leadership and lead differently. And then you get more, I think you get better companies, like I'm a fundamental believer in, you cannot get to a perfect society with half of the people in that society not being cherished or understood or leading. And so it is imperative for all of us that bias is broken, and that gender bias is broken. And it is a good thing that we're in that direction and moving in that way. And so those are the big things I had. And I would end this session with, one of my favorite bosses. The first time I was quote unquote leading a team. One of the things she said to me was, this will be the hardest thing you do. It will feel completely uncomfortable 90% of the time. That's okay. Be okay with that. Find your method to managing the process. And then every 6 months, step back, check in, and really look at the people you're leading. Have I done the best I could for them in the last 6 months? And force yourself to answer that question. And for me, that's always been my guidepost of, I will force myself every 6 months for people that I'm managing to say, have I done the best I could for them for the last 6 months? And what could I have done better? And so I'm hopeful that it's been a part of how I've gotten to where I am today. So with that, I'm happy to start with the first batch of questions if they're in.
They're in for sure. That was incredible, Chinny. Thank you.
Yeah, no
I kind of highlighted and wrote in big letters, ask for opportunities. My boss is actually on this call, so I will do that later on. No, that was an incredible presentation. I took so many great points away from that. So I really appreciate that. And I'm so happy that we recorded that, because you not only have great information, but you present so well. That was incredible. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to start reading some of the questions, and this is also a little bit of a reminder to some people that to use the Q&A tab at the bottom to submit your question, not the chat one, please, just the Q&A one. So I'm going to start because I see we have some questions there already. All right, so the first one is, what obstacles did you face when you were initially given your roles in male-dominated fields, and how did you overcome these obstacles?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think the biggest one for me is I am to the point of I try and lead with empathy. I am also someone who candidly can sometimes be a pushover. And so I ended up, I remember the first times I got into leadership roles, I would find myself over correcting to not be dominant and like the voice in the room. And candidly meant I got walked over for like 3 months of my first few leadership projects. It just meant people were able to sway me, and like, if I thought X was the right thing, but I didn't want to be too vocal in saying X is the right thing, it was pretty easy to sort of get me feeling wobbly. And I remember one of my first reviews after I started taking on leadership roles was, needs to have a voice. And I just thought to myself, that might be the first time in my life someone has ever told me to have a voice. Like, if anything, it's like, quiet down, like, relax. And so I was like, what is happening here? And I realized what it was. I was too afraid to be the vocal voice. And ultimately, teams need a leader. Someone has to be the person that sets the tone. And you cannot be afraid to step into that. And so for me, that was the biggest thing. The biggest obstacle was I had to get comfortable being the leader and saying, I believe X, I will listen to the inputs, and I want to build that cohesion in that community. But this is a guide, like I have to be the guide. And that is a really hard thing to do when you are uncomfortable in it. And so that was for me the biggest thing was, and then look, I think the second one, which is one of the reasons why I've been thankful to have more women as sort of mentors over the last couple of years, is you have to see it a little bit. Like I genuinely think, we do a disservice when we don't appreciate that if you are a woman who's never seen a woman lead, it's really hard to understand what that looks like and to like appreciate that you can do it. And so early in my career, having not seen that, I appreciate now that I didn't understand it then, but because I hadn't seen and worked for women, I wasn't imagining myself in those roles. And so I actually think the biggest thing for me was finding mentors, because everyone around you is a man, and some of my best mentors, like I have great male mentors, but having to force myself to say, I have to go find a woman who's in this career path. Their like career may not look as perfectly the same as me, but I have to see it to really understand and believe it. And so that was a really hard one, was finding women who I could sort of say, okay, you're a guide. Like I understand what I'm building for.
Thank you for that. That's awesome. I'm going to continue on with some questions because we have quite a few. The next question is a bit of a comment, and as well as a question for you. They're curious about the split of men and women that are actually attending today's session. And so I did a bit of a calculation while you were presenting, and it's actually 16% of the audience is male from what we can see. There's a couple of phone numbers, so I can't tell exactly who they are, but it's still small. So the question is, how are we bringing more men into this topic?
That is the question.
It is a good question.
Look, I think candidly, it won't be in big sessions like this for most men. I think there is I now spend a lot of my time in having to go to conferences and things. And every time I walk into a woman in session, the room is all women. I sort of go, well, I mean, we kind of all know how to lead with each other. It'd be nice if the rest of you joined us in this conversation. And so I think there is a natural, that is their problem. And so the way I always come back to is you have to influence it in small ways in your daily life. Like you have to, when men work for me, I'm very cautious in making sure they understand, like a good example is is feedback. I'm very cautious in making sure they understand how I am getting to that feedback so that they don't perceive it from a gender perspective, right? And that they appreciate and understand that they have a female leader, but I look like all of the other male leaders that they will get, and I have, good and bad here, but it comes in those, and it's by the way, forcing corrections and uncomfortable things, right? Like, my brother's a good example of, now he will never look at feet. Like, he will take that seriously because he's going to come to me and complain, and I will tell him, no, go sit down again in your feedback and like think about how you're looking at this. And so
Right.
it will happen in micro ways, not macro. Like it's going to and you have to be cautious of it when you work with women, when you work with men, making sure they are understanding, they are respecting and understanding you as a leader. I think that's the best way to get them in the conversation. And then look, the men who have been big supporters and sponsors for me in my career, it's interesting, the number one thread that runs through it is all of them have a woman that is like incredibly directful in their life. So I've always wondered, like, is it candidly, like when they see a woman they care about who is a leader and does that change the way men perceive leadership? Because I think about all of the men who've been impactful in my career have been either trained by women, they were raised by women who led or worked, or they had, one of my bosses, was a philosophy major who happened to have been taught by mostly women. Like I think it's you impacting your direct circle.
That's great. I totally agree. That's incredible. Our next question is, how do you avoid justifying your expertise or your right to have a seat at the table as a woman?
I always go back to it. By the way, I'll answer it in two parts. I think I have it's okay if someone wants you to justify it, but I have gotten very good at, I'm okay justifying it. If you have a question as to how I got here, I'm actually comfortable with that. Like, I'm happy to tell you the 100 things that I've done that I think make me ready to do this. And it's not a bad thing. I'm happy to have that debate of, are you the right leader for this? Yeah, let's have that conversation and be okay with that as an answer and be prepared for that as an answer. And don't take that personally. It's okay to be annoyed by it. It's okay to be uncomfortable about it, but be ready for it, right? Like, be ready to tell people why you are the right person for this leadership role. And that's not a bad thing. And then, how do you not over justify it, is always go back to what ultimately is the other person's goal, right? As I think about why people look for justification as to, like, why are you the leader of this? It's either, I think I should be the leader. Okay, let's unpack that. Like, that means you're probably pretty good. So let's figure out how you can be useful to, like, creating leadership, small L, in this group. And so sit in that person's need for justification. Like, what are they looking for in asking for that justification? But I ultimately come back to, it's not a bad thing. If someone wants to be prepared to answer yeah, I think I should be the person leading this conversation, and that's okay. Like, here are the 10 things that make me the right person to do it. And it's not arrogant. It's not, it doesn't need to come off as arrogant, but it just comes from I have done the hard work to be here and I deserve to be here.
That's fair. Absolutely. Our next question is, it says, "Hi, Chinny. Thanks for this session. What are some strategies for overcoming imposter syndrome and also setting workplace boundaries? This can be particularly difficult for me as a Black woman and trying to prove myself, often leading to stress and burnout."
That's a very good question. I wish I could say I had the perfect answer to it. Look, it has been, and particularly as a Black woman, it has been something I have lived and dealt with throughout my career. It's this need of, and by the way, I told you my leadership style is to be the over-prepared one. That comes from imposter syndrome, by the way. I've spent a lot of years trying to understand how do you approach situations and why. And one of the reasons preparation is my leadership anchor is it's hard to feel like an imposter if I feel like I know everything in this conversation we're having. And so my management style of the imposter syndrome that tends to creep up is to try and be over-prepared, because it makes me feel less uncomfortable in a room and in a conversation. And so I think that's been a big one for how I've dealt with it, is just I like to be prepared so that I don't feel like the imposter in a room. Now, I think the second thing that, and this is one that I've seen other people be particularly good at, is the imposter syndrome comes from your perception of how others are looking at you. And so I always, and it's advice that others have given me, and I try to do it, of before I go into a room where I feel like you always have those rooms like actually this call is a perfect example. I remember when I first got the email, I said, am I really the right person to do this? I'm like, I don't have enough experience. Like, this is so not a conversation I should be
You're the
having.
perfect person for this, just saying.
and I was like, no, I'm going to say no. Like, this is not, no one should listen to advice from me. And I took a step back and I said, okay, let's think about this. And I wrote a list. I was like, here are the pros, here are the cons. Here is why I think I'm the right person. Here's why I'm not the right person. And that for me was how to get through the imposter syndrome of, they really should go ask like 10 other people before they get to my name. And that has always been my way of dealing with it, was when I feel like that, I sort of take a step back and I go, here's why I'm actually all of the things that deserve to put me in this room. Here's why I'm not those things. And it always helps me recenter into feeling out of that imposter syndrome. And so as a Black woman, that's what I would say. And then look, as a Black woman, it's a little bit like being a woman in leadership, don't overcorrect to it. I used to do this early in my career of people would say like, you work so hard, like why? It was because I felt this need to prove something. And it's hard and it's easier said than done, but take a step back and really guide yourself in, am I actually, like, I am good at what I do. Like guys, continue to anchor yourself in that. I am good at what I do, and remind yourself of that. And it helps alleviate a little bit of that imposter syndrome.
That's awesome. Thank you. Our next question. Do you have any recommendations for a young female leader in a male-dominated industry who has been underestimated or received inappropriate comments from male clients?
Oh, that's a good one. Look, I think ultimately the number one thing I always tell my mentees, protect, it's the same advice I give friends, like, protect your peace. At any point in time, if it feels like it is starting to infringe on your peace is the most important thing. So when that line for you is crossed, and I've had this of like, I was like, this is like, I cannot cover this client. Like, this is not the right client for me. I'm going to protect my sanity and my peace and step back. And it feels like you are doing something that will hurt you, hurt your career, ultimately, I really truly believe this. Your peace makes you better at everything else. And so protecting that and creating room and giving room to that will make you better. And so that's number one, protect your peace. The minute it hits your line, it's okay to step back. Like, that's okay. I think the second thing is create lines, be okay creating little lines. So the first time that comment is made, or the first time someone underestimates you, don't be afraid to say, hey, I actually think I could have done that. Like, here's how I would have thought about it. And it forces them to realize that, oh, like, this person is clued in on, one, how they perceive my comment, and two, they're going to stand up for themselves. And so don't be afraid of setting little boundaries. Like, the little boundaries are actually really important in helping establish like your personal arena. And so the first time that underestimation happens, the first time the client says something, set the boundary. And then look, use senior leaders. Like, one of the biggest things I have to do for my team and for the women who work for me is trust them when they tell me this is a situation that isn't working, and be their voice in that situation. Like, and find the person that will do that for you. You shouldn't be the one fighting the battle. There is someone who has taken on the quote unquote leadership title and should be that voice for you. And so I feel very strongly about, use the people above you as the guardrail. And by the way, if the person above you is the person that is, that's not trusting your ability, that's not creating room for you, that's where it's really important to find others in your organization that the work, this was early in my career, I always used to have this, like, your organization looks really linear. It's just like, it's the person above me, the person above that, like, it's just like this linear line that I must report through. There's tentacles of people that have influence and spheres of influence, and finding voices outside of that linear structure has been the most important thing I've done. And so find that person that will also fight the battle with you, because ultimately it's going to take that.
That's great advice. I love that. Thank you. I have a couple of questions that were submitted prior that I'm going to read, but I know that Dr. Kelly has a question that she'd like to ask you, so I'll pass it over to Dr. Kelly.
Great. Thanks, Ms. Snyder. Janae, can you tell me, given that these representations tend to start pretty early, what are some suggestions that you might offer to high schools to encourage women and girls in leadership?
Yeah. I think the biggest one I can think of is encouraging more women to step into that role. Like, I remember being at Appleby and being just being within the class, and even something like prefect, the men would start talking about it way before the girls did. Like, it just was a natural inclination of, like, yeah, I should be athletics prefect. Like, play one sport. Like, there's a girl who plays like 3 sports and is fantastic there. Like, what are you talking about? And it was always sort of funny to me of, like, yeah, like, I should be the international prefect. And I was like, okay, great, but there's like 10 other people. And so I think institutionally, encouraging early, particularly because I think leadership when you're young, unfortunately, tends to correlate to vocal. And so if you don't encourage the quiet voice, who actually can be a very good leader, has those skill sets, but when you're young, it perceives as quiet and not leader. If someone isn't the, like, no, you actually can do this, like, this is what a leader is, and only one of those things is vocal. And when you're in high school, you don't have that depth. It feels to you like everything, that leadership is like the most vocal person. And it's like, no, that's actually, like, it's one of 10,000 things I do every day as a leader, is to talk. Like, there's actually 10,000 other things that you have to be good at. And it's always my worry is that we too early ascribe vocalness to leadership. And so I think that's a big one. And I think the second one is be more, and this is particularly for, like, when you're in your grade 9, grade 10 years, finding little leadership positions and understanding and appreciating the little leadership positions. So, I don't know if it's still on campus, but middle school, when the high school students who were middle school like leaders in the classroom. And that was one, okay, great. Like that was one where when I was in high school, it was actually mostly women that applied for the role, took the role, but it never got the same, like, you are a leader as some of the other roles on campus. And I always just thought it was funny. I was like, this is leadership. Like, these are a bunch of kids following you as a grade 10 student. Like, that's leadership. And so appreciating the leadership that looks differently than you're a team captain, you're the head of this club, you're like, to be the middle school form leader is a leader. And so to me, like that the appreciation and equalizing those things makes women who take on roles that look different from traditional leadership understand and appreciate traditional leadership, and allow them to see that, oh, if I can do this, I can also do this. If I can be in the middle school role, I can be the international prefect. Like, it creates a linear line that is really hard to see if you don't appreciate that small role first.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm happy to say that that is actually a much more robust role these days.
See, there we go. I love it. That's actually one thing I regret not applying to do. So I'm glad to hear that.
We have time for one more question, and actually that last question is a good segue into this final question that was submitted, and I think you'll like this one. What would you tell your grade 10 self about post-secondary and career planning to help with leadership?
It's a good question. So I'd start off by saying to my grade 10 self to first calm down. And everyone who knew me in grade 10 would totally agree with that advice. Not every decision you make today will set the path of everything you do in the future. So that is a good thing. And so first calm down. On the flip side of that, I think now when I step back and look at high school and college, they were ultimately a series of what do I like and what do I not like data points. And it doesn't feel like that in the middle of it, but it becomes this incredibly helpful, like, I like this, I don't like this. Okay, good to put in the mental bank of what am I gonna do next? And so what do I mean by that? You know, I remember the first time I took accounting in grade 11, and I realized, like, oh, I have a natural, like, instinct for these numbers, and this is, like, super interesting. Like, okay, like, I like this. But I was like, oh, but I don't like actually being an accountant. Like, the day-to-day of accounting class wasn't that interesting to me. And so those for me were two incredibly helpful data points in framing, what do I want to study in college? What do I want to do post, in my career? In grade 12, I took Zook's economics class and his international business class, and I loved them. And like, they were sort of like this eye-opener data points of like, oh, that's what I want to do. Like, that's super interesting. And so I think about these years as data points of, there are things you will like, there are things you won't like. That's actually okay. Both of them are incredibly helpful to this quote unquote journey that you're in. And they end up being incredibly helpful, just like guide points. And so that's one thing I tell myself is understand and appreciate those guide points. And then the third thing I tell myself is, don't be afraid. Like, I know I said calm down, but I also will then flip it on its side and say, don't be afraid to have a plan and something that anchors you. Like, it's a good thing. I always say, you're not fully formed in your sophomore year of high school, but you know yourself better than others will give you credit for. And I feel very strongly about that point of, you know yourself, and don't underestimate that, because others think that your life will happen. Like, you know yourself, and that's a good thing. And so try and step back and think about, for you, what does a 25-year-old you enjoy? What does a 35-year-old you enjoy? What are you good at today? What do you want to be good at? And then these become sort of the mini steps that move you in that direction. It's that elective class in grade 11. It's how you think about where you want to go to college. But anchoring yourself in, what is my plan? What am I good at? I actually think is it's one of the most helpful things you can do. And I'll give you a good example of, for as long as I can remember, I've sort of had 3 big dream jobs that have been like these guideposts in my life. And they implanted on me very young, but they've always sort of been guiding lights. And so having those in the back of my head have always been, they're sort of this guidepost for when I take many decisions, but they also recenter me when things don't go well. And, and I think back to like grade 12, applying for college, and my dream school was Wharton. And I wanted it, spent 12 months like planning for it. Like I thought that the PSAT score, which led to the SAT score, would lead to college, and like, this is the path, this is gonna work. And then I got waitlisted. And it literally was like, I was like, wait, things don't go according to plan? Like, what is this? Like, how does this work? And it was the hardest like 2 days. And my parents gave me the advice of, go back to those three big dream jobs that you said. Does this change anything that gets you to those places? And for me, it was no. Like, the path looks a little bit different today. But for me, it's always come back to like, I think 10-year guideposts are actually really helpful, and they help set course, and they help give you balance when things knock off. And then the hardest part just becomes readjusting. And by the way, I still do it today. Now it's unfortunate I can no longer set 25 and 35-year, 10-year guideposts. They're a little bit further out, but I actually think sitting in your grade 10 self, like I would say, go back and set 10-year guideposts, and it'll make the like little journey there. For me, it's always made it a little bit easier because it lets me readjust when things don't go my way.
That's incredible advice. I totally agree with. I love that. Thank you. Before we conclude, there's this one comment that came in that's anonymous that I'd like to share with you. It says, most of the mentors I've had or people that I reported to in my career have been extremely successful women. So my advice to women in leadership roles is to own it, because there are men out there that are extremely appreciative of all we have learned and continue to learn from you. And that comes from one of our male attendees today. So I just thought that was kind of a nice comment to share. And I just want to say, Chinny, on behalf of everybody, that was probably the most engaging session I've sat in for a long time. I learned a lot. So appreciative of you taking the time to do this today and to share everything that you did. And I just want to say thank you so much. And thank you. I can't say thank you enough. So grateful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Enjoy it, guys, and have a good day.
You too. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a good day.
Bye. Nice to see you all.
Bye.